This is our panel discussion on the blockchain. It's called Build in Peace, a look at blockchain after the hype bubble. We're going to talk about what are the actual applications, not the silly ones such as CryptoKitties, but who are the actual interesting applications when it comes to blockchain. Sigurd from Hoffmeyer will lead you through it. Enjoy.
All right. So, thanks. So first of all, I wanted to say that CryptoKitties are absolutely not silly. I will hold my CryptoKitties to death. But I wanted to just very quickly lead you through who the panelists. Let's start with you, Frederick. You do 15 seconds.
Yes, hi. My name is Frederick. I'm the CFO of BLOC. I've been in blockchain and in Bitcoin for the past 4 years. And now at BLOC we're working to apply blockchain within the maritime sector, specifically within trying to clean up the dirty business of oil.
Awesome.
My name is Lillelund. I am the CTO for IBM Denmark. And my job is, in this context, to work with our enterprise customers as well as startups on blockchain projects.
And my name is Nikolai Søndergaard. I am the chairman of Nordic Blockchain Association. We work on building this Nordic Scandinavian ecosystem in regards to blockchain that is working with the public sector, implementing prototypes. We have a conference coming up in November with Danish industry. We do events, trainings, spread the word, and enable the positive integration of blockchain technology in society.
Yep, and I'm Henrik Hoffmeyer, co-founder and board member of Coinify, which is the leading European broker of what we now call virtual currencies, as we're moving beyond Bitcoin.
All right, and my name is Sigurd Høystad. I'm an investor, advisor, reformed crypto anarchist, and true believer in most of the crypto space. Cool, so I wanted to start off with a tiny little bit of history, because last year I was lucky enough to host the blockchain panel at TechBBQ. And it was a really interesting day, because the day before China had just banned Bitcoin. And we weren't really sure what was going to happen. There was a lot of insecurity around regulation. The ICO bubble was kind of peaking, or not peaking, but starting to really take off. It was proposed from a member of the panel that ICOs were going to kill venture capital. We kind of figured out pretty quickly that that's not the case. But we've come a long way from there, right? That was right before the real bubble sort of reached its peak. The market cap that day of the total market cap of crypto assets that day was 160 billion. It's now been through 800 billion and now down back again to about 250 billion. So there's been some volatility, let's just call it. What we want to focus on today is not so much price, and actually not that much in terms of cryptocurrency, but more about blockchain, using sort of these technologies to upgrade our infrastructure for value. And I want to sort of hand the word a little bit to Jan to start with,
Sure.
in terms of blockchain. And we're going to start with sort of permission versus permissionless blockchains. And
Certainly.
I know that you have strong feelings about the subject.
Oh yes, I do. And we are working with permission blockchain in its entirely. And the reason for that is because we're in business and we're enabling businesses, and the nature of business is such that permission blockchain much better reflects the markets that are already existing. Doing anonymous blockchain is all good and fine, but it does not lend itself to business in general. So and with permission blockchain, we also do away with the black consensus algorithm that we see in cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin, spending more power than the entire country of Denmark in mining fruitless things. But anyway, my work is entirely focused on these permission blockchain, and we see adoption wholesale in this. We're currently running over 400 projects. We have 400 projects in production, and we're seeing more coming in. And we're also starting to see large clusters forming, which is quite novel. We're usually seeing one company spearheading the technology in a certain area, but we're now also seeing companies coming together on specific blockchains, for instance, for food safety or for shipping cross-border finance, and there's a slew of examples of that.
So I know, Frederick, that you are working from a little bit of many of the same topics, but from a little bit of a different angle. So as a counterweight to that, can you explain sort of how you think differently and where sort of the differences are between what you're working on and what IBM is working on, and why that matters to you and to IBM?
Sure. I mean, let me first say that we are building tech on top of Hyperledger. So it's very much thanks to IBM that we are able to do what we're currently doing. I don't see necessarily that we have that there is not going to be an existence for public blockchains or for permission-less blockchains. I think there is very much a use case for that. Although that Bitcoin, the biggest one of them, has fallen in price, we see very much this being an open financial system, and I think that is very much needed. I agree that when you work in for example, the shipping industry as we do, then it is necessary to control the information you want to share. Regarding the proof of work and the dirty things around Bitcoin, I would say that, you know, it really depends on the use case whether or not you want to use that type of proof of work algorithm. And if you want an open system where you don't necessarily know all the actors, it can be very beneficial, and I think it can be worthwhile spending the energy, spending the resources on deploying a proof of work algorithm.
But my point is here that you can actually do anonymous blockchains without having the proof of work. There are consensus algorithms within Hyperledger which enables proof of elapsed time. For instance, which has the character of an anonymous blockchain, or you can build an anonymous blockchain on it. Yeah. So the technology is there, but I think the use cases are much more interesting when we're talking about a permissioned access and creating markets where people know each other. And just take an example, and you know, when we talk here, we introduce ourselves, right? So this is very common. We say who we are and where we come from. Business works like that. Nobody really wants to talk to people that are anonymous or do business with them. So it comes with the territory.
I'm not sure I completely agree with that. I think one of the main sort of main benefits of having these anonymous blockchains is that it does enable you to do business safely with people that you don't necessarily know and that you don't have full trust in. I think it kind of removes the need for a pre-established trust, and that's more or less the whole selling point.
But isn't the real issue that we haven't yet seen any of those so-called opportunities for blockchain to disrupt really hit the main street and having an impact? I think there's a lot of expectations built into the blockchain, which we all know. But until it really hits the market with either an identity service that everybody subscribe to, or you know, some type of new Facebook login or something that we can all subscribe to, then it's all going to be Save the Tuna Fish or some sort of project that nobody really see mass adoption. And so let's not forget that the cryptocurrency blockchain, whatever currency it is, has just shown that there is a usage which can reach main street.
But is mainstream adoption a goal in itself? I think there's a lot of things that is worked on within the blockchain community that isn't ever going to sort of see the light of day.
But if you're talking about disruption, right? So a disruption, you would need to have something that really changes stuff. So that is part of the whole notion of a disruption. So everybody would like to see something change or something be much more efficient, and having some new either economics of scale or some sort of a new penetration model that will really disrupt an industry. So that is, I think, what everybody's seeking to use the blockchain to disrupt something which has some friction built in, right?
I would like to point out that why did blockchain become so popular the way it is today? And that's because being connected to the community and being connected to many of the companies and people interested in the space or working with it, I see that there's this motivation and interest in having protocols and systems that are open source where you can see what's going on and where data is inherently open to everyone. And so I think when we're building these systems, one thing is looking at where is the landscape at today, where has it been for the last decades, but also what has driven the growth and the interest in this, and what world do we want to see in 10, 20 years? This is something we also want to build into our systems. And just looking at the way technology is developing, not just within the blockchain sphere, but in general with big data and so on, we see that there's this tendency for information to becoming more and more free. And so the question is, will conditions in the future favor systems that are permissioned, or will we also see blockchains, will we see that blockchains that enable more people, more companies, and more maybe even countries or public sector organizations to join them will have a higher success rate for that very reason?
So I have a comment on that. I think we have various needs depending on the use case, right? So I'm sure you can agree with me that having your medical data on a blockchain would not be beneficial for you if it was public. So there are certainly cases where you want to have crypto on top and make sure that the transactions and the information stored on the blockchain is only accessible by those that you control access to or give access to.
There's ways to anonymize that data as well. Like when it comes to actually putting data on the blockchain,
a way
it
of
doesn't necessarily need to be clear text,
removal
right?
of access. Yes. And again, there are other cases where you want the transparency. So we're building a case with a number of large players in the market for food safety. And why? Because 420,000 people die every year from contaminated food. And we want to be able to establish quickly the source of any contamination and root it out. So there you would want information to be freely available and actionable on a very short time frame in order for you to reduce the impact of say, for instance, salmonella in papaya killing kids.
No, completely agree. And that's sort of one of the promises that we have been hearing about for a long time is exactly these kinds of, sort of supply chain and logistics operations. But I think what's interesting to look at is like how far are we away from these things actually being something that's being widely used.
Oh, it's working now.
So this is something that's in production.
The food trust network is in production. The TradeLens, the shipping platform, originally envisioned and implemented by Maersk and IBM, is now in production. We have something like 95 different actors on, including governments and government organizations. So it's gaining huge acceptance. And why? Because it reduces friction. And just to speak to Henrik's comment, what we're seeing is we're seeing reduction of friction, reduction of problems in trade, especially across borders. So shipping is cross-border. Trade finance is across border is another example where we're in production. The international trade is benefiting hugely from this.
So you mentioned governments, and I think that's a really interesting point to touch on, because that's one of the biggest changes that, at least in my mind, that's happened over the last few months or the last sort of year, is the clarity that we now have and the attention that certain government agencies are now giving to sort of blockchain and crypto, maybe more crypto specifically. So I know that you, Henrik, has been working closely with some pretty serious regulatory agencies. Is that something that you think is important for people to know in terms of what they're seeing, what they're looking at right now?
Yeah, clearly, I mean, Coinify has always been about regulation. I mean, that's how we were founded in terms of that this industry will be regulated. I know that there are a lot of ambition in terms of not applying regulation and a lot of, let's say, disruption. But eventually government steps in, and that's just how it is. And now governments have stepped in. The first step is the new anti-money laundering directive, which is going to be implemented across Europe now, which we have contributed to, which I think is good for the industry, because who would want this technology to be used for negative stuff? So I think everybody can agree to that. But it has also shown that for governments it's extremely difficult to deal with. There is a huge learning curve. Politicians are more, let's say, scared-mongered by, let's say, stories that they hear, which might not be true. And they have a knee-jerk reaction to anything like this, that they need to do something, right? But it's difficult to do anything, and now we have the whole problem of ICOs emerging. Now that eventually they got control of cryptocurrency and say, well, now that is sorted, they think. Now the ICO steps in, and what is the security, and how can we define the security? And everybody's calling the local financial authorities and saying, how should we deal with this type of product? And so there's a lot of confusion. But now governments are stepping in, and they are starting to learn. And what I think if you take it back 1 year, then at least what has happened is that government now start to understand, right? So the European Parliament, not the Commission, but the Parliament has established the blockchain observatory. There is conversations now about establishing a Euro blockchain, whatever that means. But that just shows that at least they're approaching this out of a perspective of potential jobs and potential new ways of working for efficiencies. So there's a lot of positive things to say about government stepping in terms of getting clarity in terms of this technology.
But it's also, I think we briefly, before we came on stage, we touched on backstage that that this also kind of undermines some of the key features of especially Bitcoin, that is, especially in sort of the sovereign individual movements and libertarian circles, like the power to have your money separate from the intervention of government.
Oh yeah, I would like to speak to that point. So again, that is many of the values that have driven the emergence of cryptocurrency especially. But it is also knowing the community and knowing many of the people who are investing in it or working on it on a daily basis. Another important thing is just that we have to have a realistic lens on this as well. When we do exchange, when we do trade and so on, historically there's always been some kind of agreements, or most often there's been some kind of overarching agreements between governments and so on, at least in recent history. And we need the same thing today because talking to many Danish blockchain companies, we see a problem with them even being able to open bank accounts or stub here because the regulatory conditions are so uncertain that even banks won't allow them to move forward with that. So that's absolutely important. I usually divide governance into two frames of viewing it. One is a near term, another one is a long term, which is kind of intangible and hard to see at this point, but nevertheless a question we should ask ourselves, and it is what will happen when, regardless of the regulatory initiatives that we do have and our attempts to regulate it that should be done at a more rapid pace, what will happen in the future when even if we try to regulate exchanges, even if we try to shut down services or even persecute people using certain blockchains and so on, that they still persist because they are in other countries, other regions of the world, or that people are even connecting to them through satellite, through mesh nets and so on. That was still going to be a question, and that's going to be a question we will have to address, especially when in a maybe decade or two from now we start seeing more autonomous systems emerging.
Yeah. So I have a comment on that because this is a very good point. The academic circles are now actually looking into this in Denmark. I know the law department at Aarhus University is looking into this, especially with the formation of the Center for Law and Digitalization. And being part of that tells me that this is exactly a worry. How do you legislate with stuff like this? If you take Danish law literally and the Bitcoin blockchain, we know now that there is kiddie porn on the blockchain, which basically makes it illegal to use in Denmark. So there's a conflict. And these conflicts are going to increase in the future. So how are we going to deal with that? It's a very good question. I think both or academia, but also politicians, need to take a stand on this. The sooner, the better.
I would like to point out as well that first of all, we have to remember that these open and permissionless blockchain systems is also to serve the over 2 billion people in the world that doesn't have a bank account. I think the inclusiveness of these technologies is not to be forgotten, and that we need to change the regulation to fit the system and not the system to fit the regulation. My second point is the flip side of how blockchains can or how governments can actually use blockchains. There is a lot of interesting applications. For example, within we are looking into ship registers offered by different authorities and putting their data on a blockchain. Land titles, projects like this, where the government has traditionally stepped in a centralized fashion and offered the services and around these systems that can now be taken back away from the government into the public domain and into the civil domain for management in whatever kind of blockchain system that we see fit.
I think that's super interesting. Like I personally know of projects where they're trying to start a blockchain country. Their constitution is being written, the land is secured from the government of Honduras. It's like this whole thing. It's real, it's happening. There's a bunch of like Bitcoin geeks that found out that they could actually get an island and make a country. And I think it's whether or not that's successful. I think one of the interesting things in that axis between like, do we give more centralized power to government, do we take more away? I think we're going to see way more experimentation as nation states or as forces within nation states start to try to tinker with this. I think Estonia is an awesome country. I'm a huge Estonia fan, and I think they're one of these like promising candidates for starting to kind of lead the way into sort of dismantling some of the centralized bureaucracy because they don't have that much to begin with, and they have a much less sort of attached relationship to it, it seems. I think that's an interesting thing going forward. And I think there we have this question of, can you actually give something out into the public domain and have a private blockchain? I don't think so. Like, I think it needs to be owned by the people. And I think that's a really strong point for having these open, well thought out blockchains. And it doesn't have to take the energy. Like, there are several very, very promising systems for non-POV
but you can't take away governance. You need to have governance. And just give you an example, which is quite old, from 2016, the DAO. The DAO led to the forking of Ethereum.
Right.
So what happens when you screw up a contract? What happens if mistakes are made? But even if everything is running smoothly, what happens if legislation changes? How do you deal with that? So I think giving everything out and just let it work like a DAO is probably not going to work in the long term. You're probably going to need somebody defining governance, updating governance, and also updating and deploying newer versions of contracts in an organized way without necessarily having to fork the damn thing every time.
Right, I completely agree that there has to be governance. I'm just saying that the governance can be way more effective and way more in the hands of people or of citizens than it currently is with a sort of representational democracy. Like the whole liquid democracy movement is incredibly exciting in terms of sort of at least fleshing out these concepts. I'm completely aware that this is far into the future, but I definitely think that the building blocks are being made today.
And I think
so I got into blockchain working with an American company that was developing voting systems on blockchain, and so this is a case that's very close to my heart. And I think there's a lot of potential in that. I think a lot of what drives people's interest in blockchain, again, is this notion of decentralization. But looking at history, we tend to see that when decentralization happens, there's also, at some point, a counter-movement towards centralization again. And so in building these new types of governance, we need to look at history and see what have we learned about how we interact as societies and how we trade between each other. And yeah, I think it's going to be a process of trial and error, as we're seeing with the big ICO bubble in 2017. A huge amount of money went into the investment of these different cryptocurrency and blockchain projects. And so right now we're seeing a Cambrian explosion and experimentation in different ways of doing blockchains and also governance, which is one of the key issues really in making this work, because as of now we've not found a good solution to this yet.
I would actually disagree with your point that we have not found a good solution on that. It's exactly some of the solutions can be found in the open source community around Linux. Linux is actually one of the foundations that has managed to steer a software project to the point where practically all servers in the world run Linux. That's also where the tech that we are building has its governance from. We use the open source part of the Hyperledger system.
But isn't that a different conversation? I mean, what we're talking about here is in terms of, does it help if government intervene, or should this just be left to the public and there's some sort of open permission list everybody can join in terms of innovation? So if you look back at the internet, when that arrived, it was the same thing. I mean, people on the internet, it was only for porn and for hackers, and it was really negative. And then eventually people found out that the internet, because it was open, because it was permissionless, it drove innovation. And by the end of the day, innovation won, and everybody else was a loser. And so you can say,
and then centralization kind of took over after the fact, though.
Yeah. So to counter Jens' argument, he's building the intranets, right? And then there is a huge innovation happening on the open blockchain called Bitcoin or Ethereum or these types of ecosystems. But I think that what is good is that a ton of experience is happening, a ton of capital is moving into this space. Let's not forget the price of, or let's say the market cap of cryptocurrencies is a completely different place where it is 1 year ago. Who knows where it will be next year? But clearly there is a tsunami coming of innovation because it's happening now. But we don't
the
see
teams
the
are
results.
already well funded,
Yeah.
right?
And some
Even
of
if
the
you stop funding today, you will have these
They will
well-funded
still
teams
have
that
a
can
lot of
run for
innovation,
decades, right? So let's switch gears a little bit and do some very short sort of forward-looking statements. I think we decided on, the question is, what will most people be the most surprised with by blockchain technologies in the next, let's say, 2 to 3 years? So let's start from this side.
I think there is going to be a huge innovation happening once we get these so-called stable coins into play. So when we start to have a euro, but which is a crypto euro, which is already happening now, I think Arise is working on a Danish crypto, right? So a lot of these projects are emerging. People don't understand what that will bring, but that will in principle be an enabler for people to understand that now they have something which is stable in their mind, and now they can use it for their everyday purchases. And I think it's going to, in very few years, going to change things. It's also going to change governments. It's going to enable a lot of companies to establish a bank account without having a bank, right? So that's going to create a lot of innovation.
Great.
Yeah, I agree with everything Henrik said. And also a very interesting point is how how blockchain is going to enable new entrants and new kind of business models in general. Because being able to track who owes who what and track the status of, say, shipments or of business deals and being able to monitor a lot more things real time will free up enormous amounts of liquidity in the global markets. And also, if we look at fintech and being able to, let's say it happens, I'm not sure it will happen, but being able to better track things like derivatives and so on, we will potentially see very different financial system, and we will see new types of business models that potentially allow smaller actors to join the global economy without without having to have the same kind of volume and force behind them.
I'm going to have to cut you off there if we're going to have time for all the answers and also do Q&A. And again, a short and sweet one from you.
So ownership. You're going to see a massive change of ownership. Ownership of data, ownership of value. To build on the example with the banks, banks are owning your money. So the blockchain was created as a reaction to that.
Exactly.
Banks went bankrupt, your money was gone, and governments needed to step in with taxpayer money. Well, getting on blockchain, ownership is going to change, but it's not going to change only for money. It's also going to change for anything of value. All of these escrow systems that have been built on banks and on financial institutions and other institutions that has this third-party capability or character are going to be challenged by this. Either they're going to move up and start working on governance alone, or they're just going to wither and die.
Completely agree with that.
Yeah, and for the future, I definitely see a lot of inclusion. Talking to both Nikolai and Henrik's points, as well as the stablecoin being a huge rendering in the market. You can always see the existing stablecoin that is not really regulated having huge volumes in the market, but also the automation of business processes. The advent of smart contracts is not going away. We still are in very early days on talking about how to apply smart contracts in the real world, but taking in stablecoins, combining that with lots more experience within smart contracts is going to see, it's going to be amazing. Absolutely.
I'll try to keep mine very, very short. I think one of the most interesting areas for me right now is looking at sort of how blockchains, projects that I know that are using these sort of incentive structures that you can build to change behaviors. I think just from more of a meta perspective, the fact that we now have a very efficient tool for shaping and changing behaviors in certain markets or certain areas is super interesting. And what we can use, or where we can use that, for example, in combating climate change in certain areas like that. I think there's a lot of innovation, not just on the purely financial side, but also on the behavioral side that I think is interesting. And we'll try to answer as many questions from the Slido as fast as we can with the 40 seconds we have left. If you're using a permissioned blockchain, why not just use a normal database?
Well, let me take that one. Trust. If you have a central database, you usually have one owner. And that goes directly contrary to what blockchain is all about. Even if you have
we have to stop there. And
okay.
Good answer, though. What is the most tangible blockchain project, non-currency, that has actually hit the market? First one to answer gets it.
I think you should take that
Yeah,
one.
interesting.
Well, I think we have a couple of really interesting projects. Some of the projects that IBM is working on is super interesting. But yeah, I think some of Ethereum could be a really interesting thing. Not the currency, but actually a network.
Right, we have 0 seconds left. I'm going to very quickly answer the last one. Don't you think that we're too impatient in general with the usability of blockchain technologies, knowing that the internet also took time to take off? To that, I have to say, move fast and break central banks. Thank you, everyone. Cheers, guys.